what do we do with Kyle Pitts and so many other anxiety-laden players? That and more this week on the couch. Perfect guest this week. So wonderful to see Alan Seslowsky, right? Am I saying that right, Alan? Uh,
Better than any teacher I've ever had.
oh, well, let us learn from this. What is the right thing to do with Kyle Pitts right now?
I mean, when you took him, it's not like you didn't know that this was one of the outcomes, and almost the more likely outcome, that being too good to drop, not good enough to start. You forced to start him, and it hurts you. So, I've heard you say on podcasts all this week you're waiting one more week. I've clipped him already on a couple teams, but there's no wrong answer because you're never going to be able to predict when he goes off. And then when you put him in your lineup, it's the classic guy that goes off. Goes off on your bench. So if he beats me, he beats me.
Yeah, I do think the one wrong answer. Well, no, I shouldn't say that because I always want to reinforce the idea that hey, fantasy football is therapy. It's emotional. It's okay to be emotional about how you run your team, even if it's to the detriment of the wins and losses of your team. Because first and foremost, it needs to help you like maintain as a human being. So if you're just, I'm tired of this. Like you said, you knew exactly what you were getting with Kyle Pitts, and if you are feeling now that you're experiencing that in real time that you don't want that as part of your fantasy football experience this year, I get it. However, I continue to come back to how very low the bar of relevance is for tight ends, and I wonder. I feel like the offense turned a corner. Desmond Ritter, really, if we're talking about this in specifics, Desmond Ritter turned a corner in the second half of that game, and looking ahead, what's wild about this is Desmond Ritter threw 32 passes, even though they ran the ball 35 times. Bijan. So this offense now is not necessarily an offense that is going to slow down the game, run out the shot clock, and really minimize opportunities. I like the schedule that's coming up, right? This week, the Lions. And this is why I say one more week. 9 for 132, I think is the grand total of the 3 Seahawks tight ends last week. Like, I know that Arthur Smith is rational enough to say we need to use the tight ends. And then coming up, you've got the Jags. That looks okay. They have a kind of bend but don't break pass defense. I mean, Anthony Richardson was functional against them in his first NFL game. The Texans, that's like pouring gasoline on the fire for fantasy value. The Commanders, I mean, Russell Wilson was pretty fantasy relevant somehow that he couldn't do it against the Raiders. And then the Bucks. And the Bucks sure are like a pass funnel defense. You're going to want to pass against them. So I see a chance for there to be some momentum here, Alan. But also, I'm going to take a walk down Narrative Street really quick. Kyle Pitts, I don't think everybody was so wrong about Kyle Pitts. I don't think this is like Trey Lance, and we're not sure about Trey Lance yet. But I don't think this is one of those situations where everybody was just so wrong about him. Like they thought he was going to be this big influence on the outcome of games right from the outset. And really, he's more of a role player in the NFL, the way that Arthur Smith is deploying him, which actually, from a basic level, kind of makes sense. Because why, if you know you're running the ball, why do you want Kyle Pitts out there anyway? Why do you want Kyle Pitts to take wear and tear? So Kyle Pitts can still greatly influence games, but I feel like it needs a snowball effect, right? Like he makes a couple of plays, and then that just reinforces. And also, there's this idea of chemistry with a new quarterback. And I just feel like there's one possible story unfolding here where Kyle Pitts is still a player that once he's on a roll, he can take over a game. And once he takes over a game, he puts his imprint on the offense. Enough so that we're in that moment of the deepest depression about Kyle Pitts at this point, right? You already got him at a 3-round discount from the first 2 years. And you're like, really? Jonnu Smith, fantasy football gods, dunking on everybody who took Kyle Pitts. But at the same time, that's the right moment to strike. That's the moment to check it out and try it. But we're going to talk a lot about anxiety players. And really, Alan, I'll just hand it back to you. Add anything you want on Kyle Pitts. Or what do you think about Atlanta? I'm still very optimistic about the Atlanta offense. I think Drake London, look what happened for Drake London between week 1 and week 2, right? I still feel like this is a team on the ascent. And then this game, Atlanta-Detroit, could easily be another Atlanta, Seattle, 37-31. Like everybody's going to have a day.
Right, that could have easily been Kyle Pitts who caught the touchdown instead of Drake London, and then we'd be having this conversation about Drake London and saying, okay,
Sure,
Kyle
sure.
Pitts. So, yeah, the thing with Kyle Pitts, you're right. It's like we didn't get it wrong. Anyone that thought he was a game changer didn't get it wrong. Sig, I had a friend of mine in the neighborhood I grew up in. He was like really into like dirt bikes, and he bought this like sick Suzuki or Yamaha, whatever it was, Yamaha bike. And we lived in a neighborhood where like you couldn't drive fast. Like, so you see this dude on this ridiculous dirt bike that he had no business having, driving like 17 miles an hour in our little neighborhood, right? And I'm like, what a waste of a heavy piece of machinery. And I feel like that's exactly what's going on with Kyle Pitts. I mean, imagine, the easy comparison, say, oh, imagine if Kyle Pitts was on Kansas City. I mean, we saw what Patrick Mahomes does with Titans, or just anywhere, right? Imagine he was where Sam Laporta was. So right now they're winning Atlanta. Things are working, and it's when if you cut Kyle Pitts, everything you said true, right? But it's when you're not cutting him, you're missing out on picking up Kyron Williams. When you don't cut him, you miss out on Hunter Henry. It's a short season, Sigmund Bloom. You can't hold on to these guys forever.
Yeah, I'm all about that. I mean, I definitely think, Alan, the longer I've done this fantasy football obsession thing, the more I am persuaded to think of the season. Matt Waldman brings up the 4-week chunk all the time, that the teams adjust over 4-week chunk. Cecil Zammy says windows. And just really to think about, much like in a dynasty league, I think at the most you look at a 3-year window. And once the season starts, you should really switch to redraft mode in your dynasty league. And in your dynasty league, you're shrinking it even more so. And instead of a year-long view, you should be taking a 3-4 week view and momentum for your team. And can Kyle Pitts create momentum for your team? I think it is questionable. And I think especially some of the names you mentioned, especially if it's a short bench league where you're making these kinds of choices on the waiver wire, that's where the rubber meets the road. And of course, the worst calls I feel like I end up making in fantasy or when I bet on a trend to reverse. And we're betting on a trend to reverse right here. But at the same time, the Arthur Smith offense is more by necessity than by true intent. Like, this is what they have to work with at the quarterback position. And in some ways, it's like the more successful the team is, the worse it's going to be for Kyle Pitts, right? Isn't this messed up? This pretzel logic about Kyle Pitts and his fantasy fate. And like you said, in any number of other places, he could have been done more. I like that going back to dirt bikes. Makes me think of like in New Orleans, there's a group of people that come out usually on Sunday on like 4-wheelers, dirt bikes, and they do wheelies and they just take over the road. Like you might be sitting at a red light and the next thing you know, there's like 50 of them around you, like just like bouncing and just doing things that seemingly are death defying, but there they are every Sunday cruising around New Orleans like a force of nature.
It's so good. Yeah. I mean, Sigmund, if we redraft, I'm going to ask you this question a lot as we go through these anxiety players. If every league started over today, like we just started, we're going to redraft from scratch, like, oh, that's a do-over. Kyle Pitts goes like where like Chigakonkwo goes. I mean, he's just another one of these guys.
Sure. Or the rookies. You're right. And that's a wonderful exercise. And that's a great way of thinking about this. And I think that, again, in terms of our fantasy football mindset, this is great, Alan. So easy. You make me feel more comfortable on the couch for us to really go psychological here, because when you put it in those terms, what we might get fixated on is, well, Kyle Pitts was a 6th-round pick, and now people would take him in the 11th round. But that's not what's important, because that's in the rearview mirror. What's important is that where he belong going forward? Is that an overreaction, or actually wait a few weeks and it'll be 14th round, and that's what you have to take a stand on. And I think these anxiety players are the best players to explore this with, because the emotion informing what people are willing to do is real, but that doesn't mean that it's the right move to be the contrarian and say, well, everyone's wrong about everyone that's pessimistic. But sometimes it's classically, they call it catching a falling knife. And some of these players might be falling knives. Someone brings up Justin Fields. And man, this one's also emotional. I get hung up on how multiple people around the Bears said the feeling of disappointment and discouraged, just this mindset of despair, all these nice D words, was palpable. And they hadn't really felt that before. And you get to certainly, like, what we forget, I like to bring up the human side of players a lot. I don't necessarily always bring up the human side of coaches, right? Well, we can bring up, or even general managers, but they are also in that crucible where everything is on the line, seemingly every week, at least in terms of their career, not necessarily physically on the line. And there's anxiety with the Bears, anxiety because of Justin Fields, who doesn't seem to be developing as a passer. Or maybe Luke Getsy isn't the offensive coordinator to help him do that. Or maybe just the whole regime is incompetent and they're stuck in another dysfunctional era for Bears football. But whether Justin Fields is the symptom or the cause, you've got a hard choice to make this week when you decide whether to start him.
Yeah, Justin Fields, I mean, quarterback 6 last year. He started slow and finished on a nuclear upside. Like, we use the term league winner, week winner, like kind of in cliche joking now, but he literally was one of those guys, Sigmund Bloom. And you know what I love? I love when fantasy football, like the consensus of the community has like an obvious take, and even the teams don't understand that take. And what this goes back to, you're talking about the incompetence of the organization. Do you remember, and of course, how can you forget, when Chase Claypool was traded for on the last year and a half of his contract last year for essentially what ended up being a first-round pick because it was pick 32. Dolphins didn't have a pick. Imagine that pick was used on Marvin Mims. Imagine that pick was used on, anything. And like, it was so obvious to anyone who plays fantasy. How is that even not obvious to that organization? Now, talking about cliche terms, we do a bold prediction show, and it's not a hot take show, Sigmund Bloom, but we talk about just like if everything goes right or everything goes wrong. And, most of these things never come true. But one of the things that we explored on that show was, isn't it possible that Justin Fields that the backup, Tyson Bagent, has non-injury related starts to Justin Fields? So again, all likelihood is that Justin Fields, it gets better from here. But your point about ringing the alarm bell here, they have a guy that was a Division II undrafted rookie that they kept and pushed to professional quarterback, Nathan Peterman, out of the way. Now make your Nathan Peterman jokes. Is the backup quarterback, had some college production, even though it was in Division II, sitting there. And if the season is lost, Sig, you got to think that, this is a player that they might, give a look to. So to answer your question is, I'm going back to him because who has more upside on the waiver wire? I mean, what are you really going to play, Baker and Mayfield against Philadelphia? I don't know. So he hasn't been bad enough where you're like worried about it. He's just been playing at his floor for fantasy football so far.
Yeah, he's been playing at his floor for fantasy football, and there are very discernible whys. They're not using him as a runner by design. That doesn't make any sense at all. And the offense hasn't changed, even with the addition of DJ Moore, that makes him feel more comfortable as a passer. That I feel like for a player like Justin Fields, you probably need to make the reads a little more binary and then just have an escape shoot, like read 1, read 2, and then be ready to escape. Sometimes it looks like he's thinking too much, or he's there's an overload of information instead of a focus and then a decisiveness about what he's going to do. I'm looking in Luke Getsy's direction. Also, the offensive line, which was trending in the right direction, hasn't been as much. But Kansas City's not a great. So here's another thing to think about as we look at this, going through this week by week. Kansas City looks like a good defense with Chris Jones. It certainly looks like, look at what happened to the Jags last week. It looks like Kansas City is a limiting factor type of defense when we're projecting teams. And I don't think it's going to be a bounce back week for Chicago this week. And I think that with Justin Fields, this is another classic example of a player that we can be right and then wrong. We can be right and have it correct. And then something can change and we can be wrong. It's Justin Fields running by design. And it's also, it felt like last year, is it really going to go the same as last year, Alan? Where like by week 4, week 5, it's almost like a fatigue. They're like, well, this thing we thought was going to work isn't going to work. So let's just let Justin Fields do Justin Fields, which still is problematic for the Bears organization for the long haul. But for fantasy, like you said, it was beautiful.
Yes. And didn't they just lose another lineman? I think they now
Yeah.
they're down, guard. But you know what? I know here's the crazy like what if narrative. Like,
Hmm.
okay, so there's the line gets massive penetration. Chris Jones is coming through, and Justin Fields just says, "Screw it, I'm taking off." So that's the other thing, right? He can outrun that pass rush. So. Yeah, Casey's defense is the obvious waiver wire pickup, plug and play
Yeah.
this week.
Yeah.
But
Jets next week too, I think.
yeah. Okay, there you go. But yeah, so I just think though that if you have Justin Fields, like, what are your options on the waiver wire? Sure, if Sam Howell is still sitting there, great. If you want to take a chance with Baker against Philly, who's led up a couple 300-yard games already, I don't know. I just want, especially at the quarterback position, I still think the floor is safe. Like if Justin Fields has a horrible game, what is it, like 14 fantasy points? And that's
Right.
if everything goes wrong.
Right. Right. That's when he bombs. Yeah, you're right about that. I mean, you're right that he has a safer floor, and maybe the ceiling isn't in sight against Kansas City, but what kind of ceiling does a Howell against Buffalo, a Mayfield against Philly? I mean, that's interesting. The whole Mayfield story is interesting. Again, because I love Narrative Street. I've been saying repeatedly, like, I think this is just so much better of a backstory for him. The plucky guy overcoming low expectations than the number one pick. So let's see. They're 2-0. Okay.
Yeah, I heard you say that on the podcast, man. I do like that. And I've also heard him, called this year's Geno Smith. I mean, all these things.
Sure.
This is why narrative is underrated because, everyone's, with their advanced stats, and I think advanced stats are cool too, but when you've been watching football and playing fantasy football long enough, there is this thing that you observe that you almost can't describe in stats that projects out as narrative, that you can kind of see these things before they happen when you become an experienced fantasy football player.
Well, I think, Alan, this is great. Let's talk about week 3. Let's talk about what we do with our teams. Trade this guy, drop this guy. That's great. There's plenty of that talk in fantasy football, more than ever in the fantasy football media sphere, or whatever you want to call it. But actually getting back, taking a couple of steps back, 30,000 foot view, abstraction, whatever you want to talk about, I think that absolutely this is a topic that we need to think about. And I think that the two things that you're talking about, the intangibles, if you will, one is confidence, and these two things are interrelated. One is confidence. It's confidence. I mean, this is what can ruin players' careers, and it's what can get players like grow 3 sizes in the NFL. Confidence, which also comes back to like buy-in and trust from the team and teammates. And then the other side of that is alignment, right? Detroit is a beautiful example of this, where you have alignment between or even Anthony Richardson, what we've seen in a small glimpse with Shane Steichen, or what Jalen Hurts did with Shane Steichen last year. What can you do? Okay, let's build an offense around that. Let's ask you to do that. So something quite simple. And then the confidence, right? You see how these two things interrelate, and it creates a feedback loop. And that's why the NFL does not change incrementally. The NFL changes in these inflection points, like whiplash, It's like one way, and then after one game, it's the other way. There's not a moment that, these backfields flip. We're already trying to, and this is exactly how you need to think of it. Like, even though Ty Chandler hasn't been that good, is there a point that the Vikings are just going to say, well, let's see what he can do? Does it matter? Or the Vikings running game is so poor that it doesn't matter? Or is Ty Chandler going to be that shot in the arm? And so on and so forth, where we're already starting to look ahead and see the way that these things can flip so quickly. You're just watching it, and then the next thing you know, the conventional wisdom has changed. And that's where a couple of these anxiety situations, Alan, are going to be those ones that flip back, right? But most of them probably aren't. But if you can identify or take a chance on a few that will, because everybody's out on Alexander Madison now. Let me just, since I brought him up, everybody's out on Alexander Madison. Are you part of everybody, Alan?
Isn't it funny that Alexander Madison, when we try to figure out who does this player remind me of from fantasy football from a couple years, the easy comparison is this year's Mike Davis, right? The guy who had Mike Davis had a top 12 finish to a season a couple years back on Carolina, and then he goes into the 5th round when he signs with Atlanta, and you're like, all right, this is a guy who's going to get the work. That's kind of where Alexander Madison is right now, and I had higher expectations because, the team, he had a chance to go out into free agency. The team said, no, we're stay. You're going to be the guy, or, based on the way they paid him, which was his starting running back. Maybe at the time we didn't know that was starting running back money. And then he comes out and he's had, bad performances, very public bad performances.
Yeah.
So
like the numbers might be the better part of the performance compared to what he actually looks like running the ball.
Yeah. And I still think that, also, I don't know if this came across your social media feed, but, people troll players all the time. But somebody really went after him. And, obviously, I'm all for, you hear a lot of times like, hey, don't tweet at fantasy football players. Like, again, it's funny if people do, but this is not funny. Like, people went after him just saying the most horrible things.
Yeah.
So I think that was also very public. So if you have Alexander Madison, I think he gets another chance now, right? Because the public is behind him based on that he was attacked for horrible things. So sometimes the chip on your shoulder is good.
Sure.
I think you stick with Alexander Madison. I mean, unless you have better options. I can't imagine in most 12-team leagues you have better options. If you're in a little bit more of a shallow league or a bit more of a 10-teamer and you could start, one of the Browns backs or something, sure, go ahead. Alexander Madison's more in the show me category, but I'm not dropping him. And I certainly think that he could still, at any given week, be a top 12 back. We like the offense in Minnesota, right? So
sure.
just this is one of those guys that you want to stick through it with a little bit.
Yeah, I think that I like what you set up there too about what happened with Madison and social media, and there's definitely some thoughts. Let me get the fantasy football stuff out of the way first. We may look back at Alexander Madison in the Vikings running game and just say, well, Tampa and Philly are tough run defenses. They're tough fronts to move. They're big, giant fronts that are tough to move. And this is Kevin O'Connell offense. It's not designed to do that, really, to push around big guys. And look, the offense has been successful, productive. It's moved the ball against these offenses just through the air because that's what works. And we'll see. The Chargers are a team that it's easier to get that push on. They're going to play the Bears eventually, right? Maybe that's it. Maybe that's what lights the fuse, right? Yeah. So, but I do think this is great because I feel, like I said, Alan, thank you. I feel comfortable. I feel like we can intersperse this stuff because the two things happened in the NFL. The Alexander Madison thing was one of them. And the other one was, and I'm way out of my depth because I haven't really even read a lot of stories about it, but I believe just from headline scanning that a Dolphins fan punched and killed, like a punch landed in the stands at the Dolphins Patriots game that killed a man. I mean, a man pretty close to my age. And it is, you're creeping in, even though football's supposed to be this distraction, right? And it's opiate of the masses. It's creeping in the edges of, the humanity. Like, I just think we're so alienated from each other that this time is making people feel so distant from each other as human beings and not recognizing the humanity. That's what the namaste means, right? Like the universe in me acknowledges the universe in you. And I just hope that, if the people that can hear the sound of my voice, that we continue to each individually try to push back against that because it's hard. Like, you're watching football, but then in the corner of the frame, there it is.
Yeah. There's so many of these, if you're a scroller on like Instagram Reels or TikTok or whatever, it's like you see these football fights come up all the time, the headbutt in Cincinnati, all these things. Now, first of all, football is one of the few sports that's actually better on television than it is in person, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Like baseball, way better to go to. Basketball, not even a question, better to go to. Tennis, I think, translates either way. But football, like, it's literally better on television than it is there. You have to be almost a maniac to go to a game at this point and wear like the visiting team jersey in the home. You have to be brave because you're asking for it. Now, again, I don't want to make it like, hey, the female who wore the scantily clad clothing in a bar and God forbid was assaulted was asking for it. No, you're not asking for it. But listen, it's
reality. Yeah.
Reality. So, and then if you have the knucklehead factor, mix in all the booze, man, I'm scared. I don't leave the home anymore, Sigmund Bloom. I sit right here in my blue room, staring at a wall watching football. That's what I do.
Yeah, that's right. It's easy for me to be scared. That's for sure. I'm like a house cat. So no, I hear you, and I like the point you brought up about it's better to watch football on TV just for following the action. I mean, football doesn't. It's you feel like you're a half beat behind sometimes when you're watching it live, Doesn't like hockey. You didn't mention hockey.
Oh,
The thing
hockey's
about
great
seeing
too,
hockey
yeah.
live, well, it's the flow of the game is beautiful. It's a brutal game, but the flow of it is like artistic and symphonic, almost like a ballet.
Oh, a ballet of violence. That's what I call it. A
Yes,
ballet of
yeah,
violence. Yeah.
yeah. But I'm curious. This is one of those things I want to put out there, like what people are experiencing, especially going to as a visiting team. See, we're just mixing in off the rails, and I was lucky enough, and I think the one exception to that, Alan, is going to be Steelers fans, because probably wherever you go, there's going to be a lot of Steelers fans. They'll probably have your back. But I would say there's an anxiety player for the Steelers, but there really isn't. I mean, I just think nobody's asking whether they should play Najee Harris, and I think we already, in a Tony Pollard kind of way, are just resigned that Jaylen Warren has more juice, but he's going to get more touches and not going to be able to get there. And yeah, that's where we are with the Steelers.
You know who the anxiety
is my anxiety. Yeah.
Well, you know who the anxiety player is on the Steelers? The anxiety player is Deontay Johnson. I drafted this guy like aggressively in the 5th round. And, I traded for him when Jerry Jeudy got hurt in my dynasty league. And, it's like he's out for the count now. So, man, I was like, all right, I'll just pick up Calvin Austin. He's like a 1-for-1 replacement based on 6 for 6. No, it's yeah, so Deontay Johnson, you drafted him thinking like, oh my God, I got a steal, 145 targets in the bag, touchdown regression to the positive coming. Nope, hurt, hamstring.
Hurt. Yeah, and I think, and there's a possible framing for the Steelers too that we may look back and say, well, San Francisco and Cleveland was a rough way to start the season. Remember Cleveland? I mean, as bad as Joe Burrow looked against Baltimore, he still produced. He didn't produce against Cleveland. The conditions probably helped. But yeah, I'm probably, anxiety isn't really the word when I think about the Steelers. It's more like just defeatism or resignation. So I'm probably not the right person if you're looking for bounce back, comeback narratives. Although George Pickens looks like an alpha in the making. So some of that narrative from the preseason, like he's adding a whole other dimension to what he can do. I think he's there. I think you're probably going to play him week in, week out anyway. How about the Jets?
That's my squad.
Well, that's what I'm saying. We're going to the Jets, right?
Yeah.
Because, we're fantasy analysts, but we also usually, most of us are born out of a sense of football that comes from fandom for a particular team, often geographical, often connected to people in our family and our communities. And yeah, the Jets.
It's crazy. Yeah, no, it's just crazy because, Jet fans are, nothing bothers Jet fans because they're so used to the rug pull. They're so used to the disappointment that Jet fans are one of the few fan bases that expect to lose. I mean, if you've talked to like people that are our senior and they've been, Jet season ticket holders forever, it doesn't matter what positive happens. It's just they go to the negative. But I mean, the Aaron Rodgers thing, and again, it's been mowed over a bunch of times. I don't want to go over old news, but that actually just felt like something wrong happened. Like that. I was just it really hurt because there was actual real hope, and we've seen it happen before. I don't know if you remember Vinny Testaverde when the Jets. Yeah, that was 1999. For anyone that's under 40, that the Jets got a post-peak career, Vinny Testaverde. They had a good quarterback, and first game of the season, torn Achilles, out for the year. This has happened before, so yeah, it's. But as far as now, Jets, those both Brees and Garrett Wilson are anxiety players for sure, Sig.
I think, but I think the answer is buy. I think the answer, Garrett Wilson might be tougher to buy because, again, if we're putting it in terms of if we drafted today, Garrett Wilson is probably still like a 3rd round pick or a 4th round pick. Yeah, so it's not like his value. I mean, from a early second, he's like an early second, early mid second to a 3rd is still a pretty significant drop. Don't get me wrong. But he's still valued with some esteem, although we saw him also get that long touchdown, a la George Pickens. I mean, maybe Garrett Wilson and George Pickens are basically the same guy going forward, which means you're really happy if you took Pickens. It's more about Pickens moving up than Wilson moving significantly down when you have that ability. Brees Hall's the one that fascinates me, Alan, and I feel like this is one of those things where I'm just doing my fantasy research, letting my mind wander, looking over box scores, watching stuff, just the typical chaotic but at the same time directed process preparing for the week. And I was like, what did Brees Hall do with Zach Wilson last year? And I go back and look, it was his best games. All the games that made us be like Brees Hall, bow down at the altar of Brees Hall. Zach Wilson was the quarterback for those games. So isn't everything going to be okay with Brees Hall?
Brees Hall, had he not been injured in week 7, big time injury, the ACL in week 7, he was in contention to be the 1.1 in fantasy leagues, Sigmund
Yes.
Bloom. Right. But he had an ACL in week 7, right? It's like these guys are usually 10 months to return to play, which was week 1 this year, and about 18 months usually. I mean, everything's different until they're back to themselves. All right. I was fading Brees Hall in the offseason because I was like, I'm just always going to bet against injury optimism, always. And I'm going to be wrong. I'm just making this number 30% of the time. Right.
Yeah.
But I'll be right 60+%.
Sure.
So after week 1, I was like, oh, okay, I got it wrong. But then the team's like, you know what? We're going to pull back. Right. So then they add Dalvin Cook, who's, friend of mine, Dalton says Dalvin cooked, he calls him. Thought that was, kind of a little fun bear poke there. But yeah, Brees Hall, it's not. I mean, when a player tears his ACL in week 7, and as good as he is at Brees Hall, you can't. This is what you need to expect. This bumpy road. So he'll have good games. Right. It's just now he's in the I need to see it before I start him again situation. So that's not good. You want, when you're drafting your running backs in the top 5 rounds, you want projectable volume each week. So if you drafted him in early, if you were like a June or July drafter, okay, you were taking a chance. But by August, you kind of knew this was the situation. So it shouldn't cause you that much anxiety because you knew what you were buying again.
Yeah, and I think it shouldn't cause you anxiety because you still have Brees Hall. And like you said, he may not get back to pre-injury form until next year as far as fantasy football is concerned. But we already saw him bust off an 80-plus yard run. This weekend, I say all this. This is one of those things where you have to look at the schedule again, because this weekend they play Dallas. All right, so wait. Probably, you know what? I say wait and watch Brees Hall break another 83-yard run, and say, well, there you go. Everyone's gonna be like, what are we thinking? Brees Hall was great in a terrible offense, and even if he's not going to be completely himself, and Dalvin Cook, and that's the other thing where things happen not incrementally, right? We're like, well, Dalvin Cook, they paid him money, he's not going to go away, but Brees Hall can make him go away. Brees Hall can just be good enough for them to see, like, why are we giving Dalvin Cook 12 or 15 touches a week? That just doesn't make any sense at all. So
if Rodgers was there, it would have been harder to shove Dalvin to the side because, by all accounts, it was Rodgers that was pushing for a veteran to be there. But now that Rodgers is not there, it's Brees Hall can shove Dalvin out of the way. And you have to think, though, help is on the way, right? Like, I've heard, like, oh, why don't you just get Andy Dalton? Or why don't you get, no. Carolina wants Andy Dalton to back up their young player. They're not just giving Andy Dalton away. I'll just get Ryan Tannehill. No, that's, it's... Get Kirk Cousins. No, this team still thinks they can win. If you want to get a player right now, like the best next is like Josh Dobbs. Like, yeah, Arizona will trade him if you want to give him.
Sure.
But what do you want that for? Right? It's
right.
I don't even know how they begin to solve this. So it's Zach Wilson for better or for worse, rather than what are they, Joe Flacid, Joe Flacco, whoever they bring back.
Right. I like that. Yeah, my brain always sees that. Like sometimes, do your fingers ever type something different than what you're supposed to type because they just kind of, like it's a Freudian slip via the keyboard. And I sometimes want to write Joe Flacid. You're right. And I think there's a fantasy take embedded in there, Alan, that you might not have intended. Just like I bring up, well, make your buy low offer for Garrett Wilson or Brees Hall next week, probably because it's Dallas. Some of these teams, like the Jets, for instance, if they want a quarterback, or the Browns if they want a running back, you might be better off. This is a dynasty league thing. You might be better off waiting until week 6, week 7, when teams are more resigned to their season being lost. Although you can look at a few 0-2 teams now, and if they're actually looking at the roster, like they should know, like they should really be looking for next year. So it's not too early to do that in dynasty leagues, but certainly I think that the Jets getting a quarterback is not out of the realm of possibility. But like you said, no one's like the Titans, they could be 2-0 right now. Minnesota's not ready to give up on Kirk Cousins quite yet, I think. The guy that's interesting to me is Jameis Winston. That's the guy I feel like, if you're willing to go this deep in, because they're sure acting like a team that thinks they're in a Super Bowl window or have that Super Bowl urgency. And Jameis Winston is a fascinating guy. We've touched, I think we brought up, I don't know if we really fully brought up the Cleveland thing, but I guess we need to do it because it's one of those meat and potatoes fantasy topic of the week, right? And since this all started unfolding Monday night, now we have news that Kareem Hunt signed it for a 1-year deal worth up to $4 million. How I like to say, I said on the show this morning, an agent gets their wings when we say up to. So, I suppose I'll set it up like this, Alan. All right. on one end of the spectrum, and this is kind of like the Ezekiel Elliott thing. So we do have a very similar previous case that we can look at, or even the Dalvin Cook thing, right? Maybe the theme as I'm trying to set up this question and not be able to get to it, Alan, my brain is telling me the theme is already there. That yeah, when these veterans sign, oh great, they're going to force Ezekiel Elliott at the goal line. Well, no, probably not. Oh great, Dalvin Cook is going to make this a committee. Wait and see, maybe not. Oh great, Kareem Hunt knows the offense. Kareem Hunt is experienced, and Kareem Hunt is going to split this backfield. The difference is Jerome Ford's not raw Andre Stevenson, right? Jerome Ford is not Breece Hall, but I'm not saying he might be those guys. Oh yeah, Stevenson was a 4th-round pick, but so that's the question. That gets to the essence of the question. Like, is Kareem Hunt just so washed that it doesn't matter and it's Ford's backfield? Is Ford good enough to look that much better in comparison? Or perhaps is the right answer even as it's probably going to be in Baltimore, like none of the above.
Right. Yeah. Kareem Hunt at this point, and actually most of his career that wasn't like his peak Kansas City years, is the classic hold the weight on the ankle of the starter, right? Just good enough to pull down the value of the starter from where you need him to be. Nick Chubb, look, the first year Kareem Hunt wasn't there, Nick Chubb's a 1st-round pick for a lot of rankings, but all those other years he was like being pulled into the 3rd round because Kareem Hunt was like a 5th or 6th-round pick. So Kareem Hunt's probably still good enough, given that he knows, like you said, he knows the offense, and that they brought him in, they trust him enough to sign him. I know that you brought up on some of the other podcasts that they needed to see it first with a tryout. I thought that was a clever observation by you, but. We give sometimes cheap advice in fantasy football: buy high, buy low, sell high. But there actually was a sell window on Tuesday waiver wire runs, and a couple people had asked me for advice who went all in on Jerome Ford. And I said, if anybody will give you a wide receiver that you think is like a 3rd-round wide receiver for Jerome Ford, there is a veteran coming in here. So I saw someone trade Jerome Ford yesterday for Amari Cooper, right? After coming off the big game. Now, a day later, Kareem Hunt signs. Which one of those players do you want? And just, again, just position agnostic, say that you could start either one of them. Obviously, nobody has enough running backs on the roster. So, yeah, I think Jerome Ford's going to be good. You're going to be happy you have him. But he's not, quote, league winner anymore, is he saying? He's just a player that you're happy to start because he's on a good offense but you would think now that maybe Deshaun Watson and them are going to pass a little bit more, right? This is an opportunity to really start feeding the wide receivers even more targets.
Right. Well, and look, if we're going to do a deliberate fantasy analysis, the first thing is that the pie gets smaller in Cleveland, right? You take Nick Chubb away from an offense, it's not going to be as good an offense. Is it 5%? Is it 20%? I don't know. I do know that I don't see Deshaun Watson as a life preserver. I'm drowning. Deshaun Watson is going to save this offense. No, I'm not seeing that yet. I'm not seeing that right now. So I think, scoring opportunities go down, efficiency goes down, but still within that paradigm of where they're going to run, they're effective at running. Jerome Ford seems like he's a good fit. As Diego, my man, is saying in the chat room, like they had all season to evaluate their running backs, and Jerome Ford got hurt in the preseason, and they still wanted him to be the primary backup. So they think highly of him. Now you can still take a step back and say, were they right? I mean, that's great that that's what they think, but are they right? But I do think, as I was setting up the question, these veteran running backs, I mean, what speaks loudly is that now I still think that Kareem Hunt was probably asking when Indy had him in, when New Orleans had him in. So there were teams bringing him in. And maybe he was like, I want $4 million, not up to $4 million. I want $4. I mean, look what Cook got, he was just holding out for more money, and he at least found a distressed team, his own team, his old team, to get something out of for his services. But teams aren't really valuing his services that highly right now, which points back to like, now that everybody has gone, about Jerome Ford, now's the time to get in on Jerome Ford, right? And maybe to get out and throw Hunt as the speculative guy that you're like, sure, someone was giving me a couple of pennies for him. Well, that's a couple more pennies I had than before I picked him up, and he's probably not going to amount to much. But the Cleveland offense is not going to be good enough to create a league winner, like you said.
Yeah, I mean, you're starting Jerome Ford even in a tough match. They play Tennessee this week, is that right?
And that is a tough match. This is like
Right,
Joshua Kelly last week, right?
right. So you're starting him and not happy about it. I mean, and then the window could be over, right? What if Kareem
Right.
Hunt gets the touchdown? What if Jerome Ford has 16 carries for 75 yards, no touchdown? Kareem
Right.
Hunt, they give the goal line work because they can plug. The one thing is you can't deny is they can, if they want to, plug him right into the offense, right? I mean, that is a possibility.
Right.
Like he can get 8 carries and 2 of them can be goal line. Kareem Hunt's a good player, and it's like he's not that player who was the Chiefs' peak running back. So yeah, I think Jerome Ford is a good player, and I like all those points that they said in the chat about, hey, they could have added. They didn't, because maybe they knew that they had this backup plan. And when you have Nick Chubb, he was a good number 2. So we'll see. So yeah, I mean, you're happy to have him, but it's a wait and see. It's not the league winner that we thought it might
Yeah.
be.
Yeah. Here's a theme in trade for Jerome Ford next week. Make a trade offer next week when he's
Yep.
like, when they're like, because the Titans' run defense is tough. Man, some of these things, I know, narrative street, I'm back. Mike Vrabel teams are just going to overachieve, man. Going into the season, like, well, if Mike, and I'm not talking about any particular fantasy takeaway, except maybe that Derrick Henry shouldn't have been falling to the late second, early third. Because as long as they're a competitive team and Henry doesn't break down, Henry's going to out deliver from. And Tyjae Spears is good and playing a lot. Henry is still out producing that depressed ADP because offensive line problems, whatever. This team is just going to be competitive, and I think that's tough for Cleveland, and that's tough for Jerome Ford this week. But let's take a wider view on this. Speaking of anxiety, let's go straight from anxiety to mourning. Let's go from anxiety to grief and Nick Chubb. Okay. What is your advice when we're holding ourselves out there? You're there at RotoWire, also on SiriusXM. Folks don't know Alan's work. Check it out. Alan's awesome. Someone comes to you and says, "You're the fantasy expert." I always have to make air quotes. You're the fantasy expert. I lost Nick Chubb. And let's say, now it's Wednesday, so there's not a question of how much do I spend on Jerome Ford? For the record, I said 25 to 50% of your budget at most because of the things we talked about, which did indeed come to pass. But from a larger sense, I just lost Nick Chubb. What do I do, Alan?
It happens to everyone. There's more chaos that's going to happen. It just, you landed on it, right? It's very, often in fantasy football, I mean, it's very rare that somebody gets by without injuries happening. And you know what? Here's the good thing. You could cut him, right? The worst thing is having Austin Eckler. He misses a game. Okay, I got to hold him on my roster. Oh, he's out for another couple weeks. I'm holding him on my roster. I can't make pickups. Bye weeks come. He's clogging your roster now, and you can't cut him because he's Austin Eckler. This is lingering. Cooper Kupp. Let's say you don't have an IR. The good news is you can cut them and move on. So this is going to happen to other people. There's people that drafted Cooper Kupp at pick 5, and they lost. I mean, so
how about the people that took Jamar Chase? They're the ones that we really need consolation because there's nothing really wrong with him. But
yeah, I mean, this happens all the time. This is fantasy football, so nobody feels bad for you that you lost Nick Chubb. I mean, I feel if you're in a dynasty league, you're sitting there and you're like, oh my God, he might not ever come back. And in these deep dynasty leagues, these sickos like myself, we play like 3 flex, 4 receivers. This is like devastating. So all you could do is try to like stock the back of your rosters with the Zach Moss types, the Kyron Williams types. And
right.
I mean, this is the excuse for loading up on young, every week playable wide receivers, not taking the running backs early because, I mean, even if you have like someone like Zach Moss or Kyron Williams on your roster, one of the great dynasty analysts in the space, this guy Scott Connor, he always says, if you have Joe Mixon or Josh Jacobs, those guys, they block you from playing those week-to-week pickups anyway. So if you have Nick Chubb, it's just move on. At least you can cut him.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I mean, move on, especially on the couch. I'm emotional. I mean, I do think I put out for our newsletter this morning just a little bit like it's going to happen to another team next week. This is fantasy football. I want to say for the record, though, Alan, I do feel bad for people who lost Nick Chubb because I want to live in a universe where people say, I'm putting together a football team and who I want on that football team? Nick Chubb. I want those people to be rewarded for that. right? I want that to be something that the gods smile on you for saying, I know this. I trust Nick Chubb to be a good football player for my team, whatever kind of team that is. I do feel bad for them, but
Yeah, I was
it's
just
going to
Sigmund. I
go
was
ahead.
just going to say that the amount, again, obviously not even the human thing. Of course, you feel horrible. These guys, I feel more anxiety for football players, the violence that I've seen, and normally I'm like, it doesn't even faze me. Like, oh yeah, football is violent. It's just for some reason this year it's like hitting me that like, oh my god, this is like really horrible what these guys
They're
go
risking
through.
it all the time.
A lot of empathy. This is the first year it's hit me in all of my years of watching it.
Oh
But
yeah.
yeah, I mean, if you're in, most people don't play in one fantasy football league. People that watch you guys on Football Guys YouTube channel,
Yeah.
they're in 10 leagues, they're in 9 leagues, they're in 15 leagues, and the amount of empathy you have depends on how. I mean, this is the reality of it, of how many shares of Dick Chubb you have on your team. It's just the cold hard truth of fantasy
It
football.
is. It is. It is. I've been talking more lately about that team dehumanizing thing and how fantasy football inserts that into our experience of football. It doesn't have to, though. It doesn't have to. But I do think that we can get to some specifics. Like you said, you brought up good names: Zach Moss, Kyron Williams. Kyron Williams probably is still cheaper than his production would dictate, but he's still. I mean, whether you think it's with Zach Moss, you're going to get at least 2 more games. Maybe he's a little better than we thought, or just Shane Steichen in that offense. And then there are some players I like the idea of trading for. Like I think Isaiah Pacheco is a real interesting guy to try to trade for right now. And look, one of the things I like to do is look and see who, if teams have 3 decent running backs, who's the one that they're sitting, if they are sitting one, and try to use that as a clue of who you might be able to pry away. Or even some of these guys, like, oh yeah, Raheem Mostert's going to get hurt. Like leverage that, like guys that you can get cheaper than their actual production right now, and try to just string together 3 or 4 weeks. And even if Mostert gets hurt, then by then you've had waiver wire pickups, and you're just trying to weave this as we go. This to get us this bridge to keep your team, in the running. And then the other thing I liked saying was, hey, fantasy football rewards determination, endurance, like just continue to care about it more and longer, which might be a bad thing, really, because there's better things in life to care about than your fantasy football team. But you're here because of fantasy football, so go for it.
But that's life. Isn't that life? Like the more, like there's even, you're in the world of content creation, right? You've been doing it for multiple decades, right? Because you have, tons and tons of watchers and listeners, but people will be surprised to know that there's days where Sigmund Bloom's like, was that a good show? And meanwhile, all your fans like myself, we love every single show. We can't get enough, but there's times where you're just like, I wish, I don't want to keep going.
Sure.
It's that grind, those times in week 9 where you've been doing the waiver wire and you push through it, right? So it's the same thing in life. It's the same thing at your job. It's the same thing in any hobby that you do. There's a peak when you first start, like this great adrenaline rush. Fantasy football week 1, week 2, and then there's the dark days. You lose Nick Chubb, you lose another superstar, but you find a Kyron Williams. That's how you power through that. So in anything, and I loved when you said that on your pod this week about it. It rewards literally those who keep going. When you're 0-4, 1-3, like you need to still believe that you can win, and you can. I mean, there's nothing better than when you remember the days when there was 13 weeks of fantasy football, getting in at 7-6 when you started like 2-5, and it has happened to all of us.
Yeah, oftentimes the teams that get that total point spot or the last playoff spot can make a run in the playoffs, because oftentimes for say the last 3 or 4 weeks leading up to the playoffs, they were the best team. Like they were the best team out of the mediocre teams. Things were trying to come together, because the NFL that decides our fantasy football championships a couple of months from now is very different than the one that's going to decide which teams get off to the hot fantasy starts where we are now. And the one last anxiety, and we'll do this one quick so we have a little more off the rails time, because that's the most fun part, especially with you here, Alan. I will actually lead into this one with my take. I think you sell Joe Burrow, you sell Jamar Chase, you sell T. Higgins. I think this could potentially get worse before it gets better. I think it's a lost year. However, for the Super Bowl aspirations, it's a lost year. I just think even if they sit him for, the best you could hope for is they sit him for 4 weeks. I don't think they have the will to do that. I don't think Burrow's going to want them to do that or allow them to do that. If he has any say, I'm ready to sell for like 25 cents on the dollar. Am I crazy?
All right, so right now let's pretend you and I are in a just a normal single quarterback redraft league.
Yeah.
Right. I offer you Puka Nacua for Jamar Chase straight up. Are you going to do that trade?
Yes.
I agree with you. I agree with you.
Yes. I mean, I might even take Michael Pittman for Jamar Chase. Right.
You could do better though. Just the Puka's the hot name. Right.
Right,
So
right. Yeah, I just think that, and you can see in the way that this offense is, I think it's just so clear that Joe knows he can't drive the ball down the field, and he's going to be resourceful. He's going to be, like you brought up Testaverde, like another name for the Jets, like Chad Pennington. Like if he has to be Chad Pennington, he'll be Chad Pennington, and he'll be the best Chad Pennington he can be. And maybe T. Higgins could be okay because at least he can box out in the red zone. Maybe this is actually a boon for Higgins' fantasy value. So maybe Higgins is the one to hold because after that goose egg in week 1, people aren't that excited to get him. But Chase just looks like not himself. Like he's just not. You talk about the dirt bike. I mean, he's that dirt bike on the suburban streets, and I just think that Joe Burrow, I just can't see a scenario where he returns to Joe Burrow until next year. Like the Joe Burrow that we know.
So what do you do? Like, okay, so this is a super flex conversation because in a single quarterback league, you could pick someone up on the waiver wire. You could pick up Baker Mayfield this week and just wait and see, right? Like you don't want to trade away. You're not going to, if someone wants to give you an asset, I just can't imagine they would, like a Michael Pittman, because that's usually how quarterback and deals go down. But in a super flex league, what can you do here? So if I offered, if you have Joe Burrow and you're in a 2 QB league, meaning that every quarterback is rostered, even some backups, maybe you can get like Geno Smith and a player.
Oh, I would do that. I would leap up to get Daniel Jones, Jared Goff, Geno Smith, Tua. Right. I mean, Tua you're not going to get now.
No.
But, I would leap to get guys like that. I think the break point where the talk really begins is like Sam Howell and Desmond Ridder, Jordan Love. I think we could even CJ Stroud after it looks like, hey, the Texans games might just end up being garbage time bonanzas because the problem with Burrow is like, let's take it week to week. He's playing Monday night this week. Even if they say he's playing, even if he gets in limited practice and he's playing, do you really feel good about playing him this week? Really? Do you really feel no? And so on. And then at this point, like, what do we need, Alan? We need him to like stack 2 good weeks together before we get any kind of that pit of our stomach starts to get tight when we think about Burrow in our lineup. So that's why I think like just get out. And this is that windows, right? The 3 to 4 week window for Burrow and Chase is nothing. I mean, Mixon, not that anyone's going to give you anything for him. I'm just saying, and I'm just operating on that. All right. I want to turn the page, and I'll hand it off to you, but I want to go back. You brought up a really good thing that steered the show when you brought up the idea of going to NFL games in person. So I'll tell a little story. I love getting nostalgic during this time. This is kind of, hey, I get to do what I want. I get to be self-indulgent. I haven't been to that many NFL games. I've been to a lot more baseball games and NHL games than NFL games. But I did get to see the Steelers in person once. I know that sounds crazy that I only have done it once. But it was in Arlington. And it was Ben Roethlisberger was a rookie. It was kind of the game, I think, that helped that season really get going because the Steelers, I believe, were down 21-10 in the fourth quarter. And for whatever reason, it was like 3rd and 14. I think it was Bill Parcells called a pass for whatever reason with an old ghost of Vinny Testaverde. And of course, the Steelers, I think, got like a sack fumble and then everything. And then Roethlisberger helped them come back and win that game. And there was about 10,000 Steelers fans there. And I know that they were commenting on it. Like Phil Simms was commenting on TV. People told me that the Steelers fans were louder than the Dallas fans. And of course, if you go back to the Steelers-Cowboys rivalry of the 70s, it was a cultural rivalry as much as it was a city or team rivalry. It was like just the cultures of the two cities. So I felt so good. I got tears in my eyes. When I walked into the stadium, I saw all the black and gold. And then when we went out triumphant, it was just, ooh, I can feel the feeling, the surging through me that I had that day. Have you gone to see the Jets? Have you been to NFL games in person or just any sort of sports in person memories?
So, yeah, I've been to football games more in like when I was part of like a corporate setting where you're sitting in the box and you're entertaining people. But, and I've also sat in again, I love the nostalgia feeling when I'm a kid, but my kid nostalgic feelings for games were, and I don't watch hockey anymore, but I was very into hockey during those like mid 80s Islanders.
Oh, beautiful teams.
Yeah, I used to go, where it was like Islanders versus Rangers. And I walk in, I would get like, I still think about it now and I get like, my neck hair stands up, going with, you talked about at the beginning, it's usually connected to a family member. We would have, tickets going to, the blue section of the Garden where it's the most rowdy fans ever. And as you're a kid, you kind of embrace that. You think it's cool and it's, I don't know. It's just those are the memories that I have. So, but with football, I still maintain that the experience that I've had with football, it's like you can't see anything. When
Yeah.
you're a kid, it's totally different. You don't care. But I'm talking about as an
Right.
adult. So yeah, I mean, it's so funny when you talk about like sports and nostalgia, because anyone that's like playing fantasy football or doing fantasy football content, there's always like those moments that we really like, whether it's a video game that you played like Tecmo Bowl or whatever it was, or if you know, if you did NCAA, I was the guy that ran the NCAA pool in my school, my middle school, right? You know, going back to those like 90s brackets, and then you grade them all by hand. So when you talk about like sports nostalgia, it's such a it like makes me like sad and happy at the same time. That
Sure.
same experience that you had when your team beat the Cowboys and you walked out.
Yeah.
It's such a cool thing to talk about.
Well, there's things that stay with you, right? I mean,
Yeah.
there are moments, how much I'm going to sound like an old man, right? How many things can you actually remember that happened in your life? Things that you can, like you said, the hair on the back of your neck stand up. We can time travel. I mean, we can time travel. Like sometimes something as simple as hearing a song or smelling a smell can take us back to something. And I mean, just last night, I went to some meeting for my kid's school, and it reminded me of like a couple of years of my life in high school. I was the student representative on the school board. It was kind of a boring, honestly, pretty milk toast experience, which is probably why I hadn't thought about it in 30 years. But what I'm saying is there's so many things that you may never think about again. You may, pass on, shuffle from this mortal plane. But the things that stick with you, the things that when you start to talk about it, or the things that your brain wants to think about, so things remind you of it. And when you can dwell back in that moment, like the Vonnegut Trafalmadorians that can see all of time and can pick which parts of time they want to dwell in. And we can do that. We can actually do that. But like you said about sports, this is where I'm going to project. This is me going on the couch and just projecting all my neurosis onto everybody else. I think sports, well, it's a way to actually connect with people. It's a safe place to connect with people. Hunter Thompson and Richard Nixon, a son and a father. And it's a shelter. It's escapism. It's that sports doesn't actually matter at the end of the day. It reminds me of Mardi Gras parades. You go crazy for all these beads and this junk, and it's like your whole reason for being alive is getting this stuff. And then when the parade's over, it's just junk on the ground again that they're going to clean up so they can run the parade. The outcome of the game in the middle of the game is like the most important thing that could ever happen in the world's existence. And then it's over, we can actually let it go. We can't do that with our lives. That stuff stays with us. Almost sorry, Joe. That stays with you. It's in you. Sometimes it's actually in your body somewhere. You can feel it.
Two things.
Trauma. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just two things you said there that I just really want to underline, because I think everybody watching this can connect. The reason that music is nostalgic, like you hear like, an early 90s song, or, I know that we both love 90s hip hop or 80s hip hop even, and you hear those old songs and the song signifies a timestamp in your life, like you talk about like a YouTube timestamp, you can go anywhere you want. Like that music brings you back. Oh, that's my senior year, or that was when I was in 5th grade, that song. And the other day, Sigmund Bloom, I exposed my wife to House Party, the Kid and Play movie. She never saw it before.
Yeah.
And I just said, you understand, this was what cool hip hop was back then. Because it's so, for me, it was great. But for her, for the first time, she's like, I love it. But hip hop was so corny back then because she didn't listen to hip hop back then, and kids' hair and the dancing was kind of like, what was the show on Fox called that was like Saturday Night Live, but it was way edgier?
In Living Color.
In Living Color. Like
I just brought up Homie the Clown like a week ago. Homie, don't play that.
So good. Yeah, no, the style, like I said, I get sometimes at night, like when I wake up in the middle of the night and you have a bunch of things on your mind, like I just think about like, nostalgia and things that were important, and I get sad, but I get happy. I'm like, thank God I still can like remember those experiences.
Yes. What a wonderful thing it is to be me, to have been there for these moments. And I've also been saying lately, Alan, because I'm an old man at 48. It feels weird to say that.
When's your birthday? When's your birthday?
July 6th, right in the middle of cancer.
You've already turned 38. Okay,
yes.
48, right?
Yes. It's quite a thing to live long enough to actually see things change. Whew. Boy, things have changed. The example I always use is like I learned critical race theory in college when it was like this emerging time of analysis, and now it's being banned in schools. So that's times change, things change, and that's a sign that you've been alive, and you're a lucky person just to witness. You got the greatest gift every day, and you don't realize it. Just getting to be here and experience these things. Like you said, even going back to those things, you're sad because it's over, but you're happy because it happened at all. And I'm happy, Alan, that when I asked you if you were available this week, you said yes. And we got to spend this hour together, and we got to spend this hour with all of our wonderful fantasy football people that allow us to get to do this. Check them out, Alan Seslowsky, SESLOW.
Yes.
RotoWire, and SiriusXM on Sundays, right?
Sundays at 9 a.m. If you have Sirius, we'll just do the quick injury update. So flip on channel 87, Sundays at 9, channel 87, SiriusXM.
And the couch usually Wednesdays, 2 p.m. Eastern. Thank you, folks. We love you because you're so classy.